This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 32. About a first impression being a two-way street, probably every parent before the kid leaves for school is make sure you make a good first impression for your teacher. Well, we should be making a good first impression too. We have to make 30 good impressions or however big our class is. And so I really wanted to do that. And, it fit into the culture of my room.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
What's going on, everyone? This is Ken Erman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I'm here with my co-host, Mr. Matt Bulletin Board Rogers. Matt, it is August 1st when we are recording this, which you have gone on the record before saying that this is when you turn school mode on. Your school district starts in the middle of August, and so we thought we would talk a little bit about the first day of school, the first week of school, how we approach that. And a little story behind that as well. But it's August 1. How you feeling? What are you feeling for the 21-22 school year?
Ken and I were talking before this. I just checked my roster, which came out. I've got schedule. I've got roster. I've got first day of clothes ironed and ready to go. I usually take all of my clothes at the beginning of the school year to the dry cleaners and just get them completely done and prepped at the beginning of the year, and then I can maintain it the rest of the year. So whether I want to ignore the commercials talking about back to school or not, it is coming quickly. And so next week begins probably going into the classroom and getting it squared away. But honestly, I am not ready. Oh my gosh, I'm not nowhere close to ready, but we never are. I think last year was very deceiving since we were at home from March on. That it just seemed like summer was endless, even though we were working plenty at home. The idea of 2.5 months have just, well, I guess 2 months at this point, have just completely flown by. And it's been filled with what it needed to be, what we made as advice, taking time for ourselves, getting a few things that we don't normally get done, trying to better ourselves and connect with other human beings inside and outside of the profession. So it's been a wonderful summer, but yeah, it's coming to an end quickly, and right now I'm in a little bit of dread, but that will shift to excitement in the coming days. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. It's kind of, I know what you mean. It's like you feel like you're kind of like scraping off scar tissue to get started. But once you make it past there, then everything feels good. You're back in the groove, and you got the momentum going of being in school every day. So I know that feeling, and I'm sure all of our education listeners can relate to that. So for our show today, Matt's actually going to kind of grill me or interview me about something I did a few years ago when I started the year a little bit differently when I taught 5th grade. But before we get into that, Matt, just what would you say is your top priority we'll say the first day or the first week of school? What is your top priority that you make sure you accomplish in that time?
So I think we've heard it as people's lesson lens and their exit ticket answers. It's establishing a culture of respect, but also care and support, and trying to do whatever it takes to make that feel comfortable. Usually the first priority ends up being logistics. This is a new room. This is where you are supposed to be. Expectations for bathroom. Here's the first exposure. The kids get to schedule. They don't see the schedule ahead of time. So what is kind of drink situation and bathroom situation and lunch and recess, all of those different features, all those logistics. And unfortunately, I remember this being the hardest part, is that first 25 minutes is the most important 25 minutes in the entire school year. And one of my gripes, and one of those things that hopefully, Ken, you can kind of tap into through this episode to be beneficial, is you have to establish what your classroom's going to be when you're introducing yourself to kids. Really, you have the butterflies yourself. You don't have these systems in place. Even as a teacher who's been doing this for a while now, I mean, this is my 13th year, I feel like I forget what are my priorities. And they come back immediately when the kids walk in the door. But if I were to answer your question, I have no clue. Like, it is out of my brain until they're there and I'm here and it's game on. It is a naturally occurring thing, but it's so important that you set up systems and expectations and a rapport between the kids from the moment that they walk in the door, drop their things off, find a seat, and everyone takes a deep breath and gets started.
Yeah, it's you feel like you have a million things to do, but you also feel like there's only one thing that matters. But to be able to balance them and accomplish them is really important. And a lot of those epiphanies came to me in what we're going to talk about today.
Well, I think we've had conversations as well, and I apologize. The guest is forgetting. I'm forgetting. She was a Spanish teacher, and Laura, and she mentioned just the idea of knowing a kid's name is
knowing how to pronounce their name.
Yeah, how to say it, what is the preferred name, is such an obvious thing, but it sets the tone from the beginning of, I'm interested in hearing what you want and how you want to be identified this year. You were called Charles last year, but you want to be Chuck this year? Be my guest. I'm here to support that. Whatever the case may be, that comfort level is all you can do to support the kids.
Yeah, and what I loved about her approach was she used Flipgrid. And so the kids privately told her that. Whereas, I thought to myself, well, yeah, I always ask the kids, what they prefer to be called. But you're doing it traditionally where you're calling roll in front of the entire class. And you're asking them, is that what you want me to call you? They've never met you before. They're nervous. They're nervous to be in their new room. So they're just kind of nodding their head unless they're a really strong, outgoing personality. And so the way that she did it through a Flipgrid being private, she definitely was getting what the students actually wanted to be identified as by name with that. So I'm handing the reins over to you, Matt. We're going to... Matt and I have had episodes without guests where we kind of just like discuss a topic. And for this one, we want to take a little bit of a different approach where it's going to be a little bit more about my classroom and an experience that I created for my students and with my students a few years back. So Matt's going to really kind of drive the conversation here today.
Let's get going. So to talk about this, to set up the environment, it obviously starts right about now, a few weeks before school technically starts. And there are teachers across the country that have already started going into their classroom, building bulletin boards, figuring out seating plans, obviously looking at curriculum. All of those features are things that are high priority to you. But what Ken and I've had known each other for years, and he essentially just scared the bejesus out of me with what his beginning of classroom kind of priority order. And I know it was progressive. We'll talk about it. But it blew me away that you could go into Meet the Teacher night in this capacity. I'm trying to really drum up the excitement and intrigue. You go into Meet the Teacher, you go into the first day of school, and you really build that first week as an engineering design process that represents what you do the rest of the year. It is glorious. So let's start kind of in like 3 different tiers. 2 to 3 weeks out, what does your world look like? We probably should go day of and talk about that first, just so the audience understands what's going on. and then move
And
on
then
from
kind of
there.
backtrack a little bit.
Does that work for you?
Yeah. So what it looked like day one. So okay, so this was this was probably my fifth or sixth year teaching fifth grade, and my students walked in on day one, and there was a pile of 30 desks and 30 chairs sitting in the middle of the room, and nothing was set up. My desk was there, couple bulletin boards that I would typically have. I usually had more blank bulletin boards that we built throughout the year with different, word walls or things like that. But putting that aside, it was literally a pile of 30 desks and chairs. And I stood at the door and the kids walked in, and the directions on the board were find somewhere to put your bag and find a friend or a new friend to talk to. And that was it. And so the students are walking into my class, and some are almost, it seemed like they were oblivious. They're not really thinking about what transpired, but I'll say the type A personalities, especially not to be too stereotypical, but like you have those really organized go-getter girls in fifth grade versus the boys being all over the place, just like shocked, scared, like, their jaws dropping to the floor when they're seeing the way the classroom is set up. And so, the reason behind it was I had made the decision that year that I wanted to transition into more of a flexible seating classroom. I wanted something a little bit different than just the typical 30 desks. And at some point, I'll never forget, I was sitting on the beach when I came to this realization. I said to myself, well, why don't I not set up the room and let the kids figure out what they want the room to look like? And I'll try to steer them in the direction that I want, but why not make it a joint effort? And so that was why they walked into the room that way. And so the first day, we literally spent the entire day. And honestly, we spent probably about 3 days getting the room to where we wanted it to be. And so I did my traditional talk that they give in the beginning. The first thing I say is that, this is a safe place. Once you enter this room as a member of this classroom, like, I have your back for life. Anything you need, I will give you. It's not just in these four walls, but it's everywhere. And we have our back as a group. We support each other. We protect each other at the cafeteria, at the playground. So I have that talk where I really just talk about relationships between all of us. And so I told them, I said, the room is not set up. We're going to design it together. And the kids got really excited about it. And so, honestly, I had no plan of how I was going to do it. We talked about in a recent episode a few weeks back with Linda from the Teacher of the Year from Montana, and we talked about sometimes you just go for a project and you don't really know where it's going to go, and you see if it works out or not. I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't really know how I was going to get there. I didn't know if it was going to take 20 minutes, if it was going to take 2 days, and so I split them into teams, and I said, I want you to design the room. What do you want our room to look like? Everything is fair game. I have one request. You have to put my desk somewhere. That's all I need. And actually, the year after that, I got rid of my desk too. But you have 95% of the real estate is yours. And so what was interesting, and I didn't expect this, and it really fed into more of what we did. The students were drawing up the room. They were drawing their fourth grade classroom. And there's nothing wrong with the fourth grade classrooms they had, but I'll never forget this. I had groups that were saying, here's where we take attendance. Here's where we turn in papers for homework. And all these little things, and it was about systems like that. It was about attendance. It was about lunch count. It was about where to turn in papers, where to pick up papers. It was not about learning at all. And so I found an article on Edutopia that talked about what a flexible classroom was. I tried to find like the most basic one that I could, and we read it as a class. We sat at the front. Everybody had an article. We dissected it. We talked about it. We did a compare and contrast of a traditional classroom and a flexible classroom. The article happened to have a couch in the picture, so immediately the kids all wanted a flexible classroom when they saw the picture of a couch. But it transformed the goal of setting up the classroom to be setting up a learning space. And so we talked about what do we need in a classroom? And we decided we needed two things. we needed a place to store our space, or I'm sorry, to store our learning materials, and we needed a place to work. And so we laid out what are all the places that you can work: laying on the floor, standing at the counter, sitting at a desk, sitting at a table. And, what do you need to store your space? And we really decided it's like a 12-inch by 12-inch by 12-inch, square or rectangular prism. That's all we need. And so it totally transformed the way that they redesigned the classroom. I don't know. Do you want to ask me anything specific? I know I'm kind of going on here, setting it up, but the end result was, well, we can talk about the end result later. Do you want me to
Perfect.
backtrack with anything?
Well, before I go forward, what were some of those items that, again, I know that you did this with subsequent years afterwards as well. It changed a little bit. You mentioned taking the materials out into the hallway, so it was truly a blank canvas. What are some of the points that the kids brought up that we almost have a fixed mindset as teachers of this is how it would be structured? I actually did a similar activity, and I found myself influencing the kids of how it should look from my perspective, instead of really having an open eye and open ear to what the kids were suggesting. What are some of the points that they brought up? Hey, we need to have this station, or when they got away from this is how fourth grade did it. Just innovations or thought processes that maybe we aren't conditioned to have.
Well, I think one of the things they started to talk about was how do we maximize our space? Because my classroom's not huge, not small. I would say it was a very medium-sized classroom, and it was, how do we maximize our space in here? So we talked about, seats and chairs, and we had a conversation of, do we have to have 30 chairs? If everybody's not going to sit at the same time, do we need them? Part of it was one of the most difficult things was trying to get them to understand how I taught and how we were going to be doing a lot of independent, station-based, small group-based work. So them understanding that fed throughout the year of changing the way the classroom was set up, because they started to see how, we didn't need the traditional front of the room very often, because I met with small groups anywhere. But even little things like, someone having an idea like, hey, can we put a desk in the cove in the hallway for our attendance, lunch count, and communication stuff so that we don't waste that space in the room? So I think one of the most interesting things was just seeing how creative they were with asking questions, or trying to identify problems or solutions to it, or just asking, does it have to be this way? Do we have to do that? Do we have to have this? Just getting them to kind of ask those questions. And on the first day of school, those questions typically come after a month. It was happening before lunch of the first day of school, because I think they immediately saw, I always told my kids, this is our room. I always said that from my first year. They never got it until that year, because I literally had nothing set up. Talk about actually taking action and going out on a ledge for the kids. I literally didn't set up the classroom, and I was letting them move anything they wanted around. And so then one of the other big pieces that came out of that, to answer your question as well, was, talking about, do we have to use desks? Where'd you get this table, Mr. Erman? Are there more of them? And so they actually went to the principal and asked if they could, rummage through the storage room with furniture. And so, like you said, Matt, it turned into them finding 4 more tables. And we decided to move almost every desk out of the room. There was a few kids that said they would prefer to keep a desk versus a crate to store their stuff. And they were literally walking down the hallway on the first day of school, carrying 25 desks and carrying big tables back, as I stood to the side and just filmed them and didn't break a sweat carrying anything.
So, which is right up your alley. So I have 2 questions, and then we can kind of pivot in different directions. You mentioned principal. They went and advocated, which I know they've done for other activities as well. I'm sure it was wise of you to give your principal a heads up, or grade level
Definitely.
members a heads up on that. So I want you to speak to that. And I also want to speak, before I forget about it, about kids that struggled with this structure. I think we have a presence of people in the autism spectrum, as you mentioned, the type A type personalities that really, I'm saying, hey, we need to build comfort, and you're creating chaos. How did you provide scaffolding or support for those that really struggled, that normally wouldn't have? First of the day of school in college traditionally is you get the syllabus and you don't really do anything more. That's not necessarily the thing in elementary school. The first day of school is just icebreakers and getting to know each other. That could have been chaotic. So those are my two challenges, and then we can kind of bump to before and after.
So I would say I'll answer your second question first about the students. So I did have students with autism in that class, and they, in theory, should not have thrived in that at all, but they did. And the advantage there is it's obviously students with IEPs, so I knew who they were, and I was able to more closely monitor them. Aides that were in the room supporting the students, again, kind of having that open conversation with them to say, here, this is what's going on. To be perfectly honest, they probably struggled with it more than the kids did, them like being uncomfortable with the amount of chaos that was going on in the room. And for the other students, not really knowing them too well, it was just, I had to do my best to make sure that I was just reading the body language of every kid, checking in with them as we went through the process, and we made, major decisions like getting rid of desks. Every student submitted an individual, like Google form, or maybe even just a slip of paper, I forget which, saying like, I want to keep my desk, or I'm okay with having stuff in a box or a crate and just sitting anywhere. And so I had I think it was 6 or 8 kids that said they wanted a desk. Those 6 or 8 kids got their desk. I didn't question them. I didn't say, you know what, most of the class doesn't want desks. Like, we're not doing desks. So I made every effort to show them that we were making decisions as a group. But at any time, if there was something that was important to them, that their individual opinion was going to shine through and be a part of it. And I would say it takes experience and confidence in managing a classroom like that. I had been teaching in a student-centered mindset and instructional style for a while, so monitoring students individually was something that I was comfortable with. This was just a different facet of it. As far as the principal, yes, I told him beforehand. I said, listen, this is my idea. This is why I want to do it. This is why I think it will benefit students, which is always what I'm saying to an administrator when I'm asking them permission to do something that is wildly different. Here's why I want to do it. Here's why it benefits students. Those are the two most important things that you have to share with an administrator, because that's what they can get behind. That's what they can support if they need to go out on a limb for you, even one layer further. It was also important for me to ask that because, as you alluded to earlier, our Meet the Teacher night, our open house, whatever you call it, is 2 days before the school year starts. So picture this. You have parents of 30 children walking in to a room of 30 desks and 30 chairs piled up. Actually, I probably took like 10 or 12 chairs off the pile so some people would have a place to sit. And the faces of parents was priceless. It was absolutely priceless. Now, again, I had been in this school for 5 or 6 years, so I had a decent reputation. A lot of parents knew me from siblings or just, being around in the school for a while. But, you could just read their face thinking like, what is this guy doing? He's not even ready for open house. And so when I did back to school that night, I talked to him about it, and I told my parents the same two things that I said to my principal. Here's why I'm doing this. Here's why I think it's going to benefit your kids. And I did not have one parent question me or that night or ever about that. I had a lot of parents super excited. I asked them not to tell their kids. I wanted the kids to kind of like be shocked like they were. They were excited to, be a part of that. And, it's really easy to, in my opinion, it's really easy to get support when you answer those two questions. and when it's genuinely coming from your heart of you believing that it's going to be beneficial for their kids. And, I reinforce just what you were talking about before about how I was going to support the kids, how I was going to make sure that they weren't getting overwhelmed or anxious about the experience. But all those pieces, it really fed into what I ultimately wanted. And what I ultimately wanted was my students to truly feel like it was their room. They were not members of Mr. Ehrman's classroom. They were a part of the team, and I was just one member of that team. I was the tallest and the oldest. That was my role. And so it really just all fed into that. And as you said, to fast forward to the end of the year, I asked this group, should I do it again? Should I, because at that point we had all the tables. We even got some stools from like a donor's choose. We got a couple exercise balls. I said to them, should I leave this class just set up while we're considering this awesome flexible space that we built throughout the year, or should I start over? And they all said without hesitation, do what you did for us. They told me to stack everything up in the middle. And it ended up just being empty because I wasn't going to carry 30 desks back. So I kind of I stashed the tables away because I didn't want to lose them. But I did it all over again. The kids next year walked into an empty room, and it's been the same result every time. They said start over, because what they loved the most is that they did it. It was their room. It didn't matter what we had in the room. It could have been 30 desks. It wasn't about the tables. It was about the kids designing the space themselves.
I think it's a. So if you're listening to this, I want you to take a deep breath and realize, because when I first had this conversation with Ken, it almost sent me for a panic. I think I was most fearful about Meet the Teacher Night. I was, because it is for the few parents that you aren't associated with yet. We're also older grade in elementary school. Kids talk about their teachers all the time. Our names are not the first time coming up when the homeroom list comes home in the summer. Your teacher identification letter is. I think, Ken, you bring up a good point, though. You'd been teaching there for a while before doing it. And so there's elements to pull in that would be a little bit more conservative, because I think that there's a tough balance of professionalism and a good learning experience. And I'm not saying that those are on opposite ends of the spectrum, but you could quickly see how it doesn't look professional and you're playing defensive and you're trying to pull parents onto your side or students onto your side or administration onto your side, compared to just actually being the intended purpose. And I think having some clout, having some reputation absolutely helps that. But there are definitely ways to pull it in. I remember when I did this, one of the things that I kept on saying is, we're going to build our classroom together. And that included our walls. Our walls were very empty. And I think this is something that a new teacher tends to do. And I get myself caught in it. I did this past year. We fill our walls and every crevice in a classroom to make it look like a great learning experience. And we don't use 90% of it. We don't reference that word wall. It was a vocabulary word that we talked about in the second week of school, and we stopped doing word wall words by the third month. There are elements of tenses or the writing process or mathematical vocabulary, whatever the case may be. You put things up in your classroom and you structure your space in the classroom to be functional. And I think that's something that I try to be really intentional and purposeful about. It's hard because most of our walls are made out of cinder block. And it doesn't look like a homey place to be. And it's not a paint that you can change, and it's not a shape that you can change. The only thing you can change is how you teach and the layout of the desks. But it for me, Ken, when you brought that up and you went on a limb and you obviously did the pre-work to make it possible, which I think was helpful. I had the same conversation with my principal. Another thing to bring up furniture. A lot of times we think about bringing our own furniture in, and you'll realize, based off certain places, especially if it's relatively recently modified or updated or built, they don't want you to bring personal materials in. So I found myself in the same place where I was going into storage closets of things that the district provided. It's a little different when you have like a little tote bag or a filing cabinet, but just some precautionary items that I just wanted to put out there as things to consider whether you're going to dive in. I guess going from that point forward to make that shift, Ken, you obviously set an incredible tone, and a lot of things that you couldn't have pre-planned, you had to think on top of your feet because it was new for you as well. And that's the beauty of really the teaching that we all try to do, which is not, I may have a scripted program, but I try to make it come to life. I may have a assessment anchor that I need to hit, but I try to figure out a creative way to teach it. That's the art of teaching. Talk to us about what the next month looked like, the first month of school looked like, because you already talked about, hey, it took kind of 3 days to get it situated correctly. I'm sure you made adjustments throughout the year, but also, so talk about those adjustments, but also talk about the benefits about that culture that you created, because I'm sure you prioritized culture before. This just is a concrete, monumental way to set that standard. I go back to that Creed's crew type mentality of you set a standard on the first day that stuck with them the entire year. So reinforce my statement and prove me to be right with that.
Yeah, I to hit on a few things that you were talking about in that question. You talked about setting up your room, and the first year teacher, very, especially elementary, but I'd say even secondary a little bit. Just it's your room. You're excited to finally have your room as a teacher, and set up those bulletin boards, and those go for the Twitter, Instagram moments where you're posting pictures. And I remember, and I'm not. So what I want to say first is to go back to show 3. A quote that always sticks out to me from Rhett Oldham was, "Don't do something because you hear another teacher do it and you think, well, it works for them, it should work for me." You have to do what matches your personality and your teaching style. I am very okay with just totally giving up all control and bringing it back, or just keeping the boat afloat. If that freaks you out, if that panics you, what I did is not the right way to start the school year. It was the right way for me. And so, but you can find pieces to modify the way you're doing things. And for me, to hit on the quote behind me about a first impression being a two-way street, probably every parent before the kid leaves for school is make sure you make a good first impression for your teacher. Well, we should be making a good first impression too. We have to make 30 good impressions, or however big our class is. And so I really wanted to do that. And, it fit into the culture of my room. I run a student-centered classroom. I need my students to be able to make decisions. I need my students to be able to advocate for themselves. I need my students to be okay with having choices and not being told exactly what to do. Well, in my mind, there was no better way to set that up than to demand it on the first day in a fun way, in a way that they've never experienced. I wanted my students, and this is, I truly think this is advice that any teacher can apply regardless of what you do on the first day. Are your kids excited to come back on day 2? All right, Tom Murray is a phenomenal educator to follow, and I remember seeing that from him. Are your kids running home excited to go back to your classroom on the second day of school? That is something that every teacher can strive to do. And maybe you don't do the syllabus on the first day, and you don't have to do what I did, but you do something different. What are you going to do that first day that's different, that gets them excited to come back? And so those were the two things that I was trying to balance. And so, to talk about what my classroom looks like, for that first month, it's setting up those routines and those expectations of what small group instruction looks like, what what our class looks like, especially in math and reading, where you're doing a lot of independent work and you're rotating into flexible small groups. Sometimes it's just you and me. Sometimes it's four of us. It's really being able to work on the fly and just adjust as we go, as I make decisions through the instructional model that we're working. And so again, that first day, those first 3 days fed into that. I wanted them to feel like they had the ability to make decisions and to take control to be able to be successful in their room. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, and I think that that's the key behind this. And I open by saying the most important time is the first 25 minutes of the first day of school. But I also want to kind of caution and say you haven't lost the kids if it didn't go well, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we have to also be malleable. And I think that's another thing that you and your model of being student-centered is really, here are ground rules, but kids already know the expectations. You're not necessarily commenting on a kid for doing something that is in a gray zone of was it right or wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important thing, whereas we often can change as teachers. If it is teacher-centered, we can kind of change our impression of how we feel like something's going in our classroom. And I don't know if that's making sense, but what I'm going for is I feel like with what you created, it not only set a standard of how the culture was going to be, but it also set a culture for how the learning experience was going to be, how the culture of the classroom management was going to be, how everything operated from almost that, hey, Mr. Ehrman gave us a little bit of freedom. We could either take advantage of it, or we can recognize that he respects us enough to give us that chance. And I'm sure, again, all you're kind of doing is kind of steering the group to what their expectation should be. Ideally, are we making it rigorous enough, or are we diversifying the instruction to reach everyone's level, as opposed to is everyone involved in what we're doing? Can you talk
can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
To what you asked about earlier about the A-type personalities and the kids that are going to struggle in what you could very well describe as a chaotic room, especially the first day. I've always found that, and I don't know, and I kind of am realizing this now. I feel guilty almost saying, like, everybody does well in this environment. Like, I know there should be people that struggle, but they don't. And part of me thinks, like, am I just not paying good enough attention? Do I not know my kids well enough to be able to honestly answer that? But the impression that I gave them from the moment they walked in, and then really finding out why the room looked the way they looked, is I was telling them, you are the most important thing / person in this room. I left everything out for you. This is your space. When you walk into a room, and there's nothing wrong with this, but when you walk into a room and all of their workbooks are neatly stacked, and you spend time they write their names on every workbook so that they don't lose them. What are you saying is the most important thing in the room? And, I'm not saying this to discredit any teacher that does that, because I did it and we would still eventually do it. But does it have to be the first day of school? Do you have to give out the math workbooks that you're not going to use on the first day of school? Why can't you do that the second day? I was saying to them, you are the most important thing for me in this room for the year. We will learn. And I tell them, like, listen, you may have heard my room is fun. This may look fun. I'm going to make you work harder than you've ever worked before, but it's going to be different.
Interesting. Can I challenge you real quick? Because what I'm taking as feedback, and maybe I am a person that hands out materials on the first day because we can get it out of the way and get into certain things. Not necessarily what they walk into, but what you're saying is the reason that you feel like it works for everyone. I'm just making a hypothesis. It works for everyone because they've done 5 years of school before they came to you. So they
That's very
know
true.
what the first day of school looks like over and over again. Hey, this is how it rolls and beyond. Um, I would imagine if a second grade teacher or first grade teacher, especially this past year with COVID, if they were at home, you may have to create an environment that is super structured. It's
Yeah.
naturally going to be more structured anyway.
If I was
I guess
teaching second grade, it would look different. There's no way I would be able to do it exactly the same way. You're 100%
so.
right.
So I guess with that element of kids know how to be students at the point that they came to see you, which they can make those adjustments and say, hey, that we're just jumping into an activity in fifth grade. How would you adjust and say, hey, I want to create a maybe not similar experience, but a student centered or hey, I'm prioritizing you at a primary grade where we won't say kindergarten. Kindergarten is a total different beast that they are just learning
They're
how
babies.
to live, right?
Yeah.
And even first grade is tough in that realm too. But if you were to be a primary teacher and say, I want to prioritize my kids and I want them to feel like this is a safe space and I want this to be something that we build off of, how can you, again, off the top of your head, maybe not take all of what you do on the first day of school, but features that could portray a similar message with more structure?
So I would definitely say I would not hand out any learning materials on the first day. I just don't think it's necessary. I would definitely want to have activities, icebreaker games set up that kind of model expectations for what learning looks like. So even as a primary teacher, when I taught second grade, I still used a lot of stations in that room. And so even setting up, games for them to go to from station to station, so they literally feel what movement looks like in the room. Because when you do things like this, and when I did this activity, you really quickly learn who your kids are, what the personality types are, who the leaders are, who the goof offs are, all that kind of stuff. I learned it quicker than I ever had. So I would say, still getting back to trying to create an experience that kind of will match what the room will look like. Those would be the two things that pop off the top of my head in regards to that question.
So a follow-up question, whether it's second grade, whether it's fifth grade, whatever the case may be, through this environment, what did you feel like were the must-have rules of your classroom? Because we could all say, like, raise your hand if you want to speak, remain in your chair, unless you're moving around for a specific purpose. What did you feel? And I feel like a first day of school traditional activity is, all right, class, let's brainstorm a list of rules, and we're all going to put them together, and you're going to write them so that if you wrote them, then you
Sign
know
the
how to abide.
Constitution.
Yeah, like you abide by it because you came up with these rules. Realistically, as you mentioned, kind of with your classroom structure, it was the same rules that they followed in third grade or the years before. So, what are some of the guidelines or kind of focus principles that you said, hey, I need to prioritize this so that it didn't get out of hand?
So what's interesting is that what could be considered kind of a fluffy activity where, you like you said, you write the rules. It's the same rules every year because the kids write the same rules every year. They sign it. We did do that, but it actually had way more meaning than we ever had before. And it was a lot of what do we need to do to independently be successful in a flexible learning space once we had gotten to that point of setting up a flexible classroom, and what do we need to do in terms of others, interacting with others to make it a successful place. And so we kind of had a poster that I designed with the topics that we came up with, and we kept adding to it throughout the year. Some of the big things were about like choosing your best working environment, because they could work anywhere that they wanted on a daily basis. And so it was, choosing to work. If you don't work well with your friends, don't sit with your friends. If you do work well with your friends, sit with your friends. That's a choice that you have to make. And that's something that a lot of kids learn throughout the year and realize like, wow, I just don't do my work if I sit with my friends. And you have others that they sit next to their friend. They don't talk to them the whole time, but they just like that physical presence. Another really big thing that came out of that was just about mutual respect towards others. And, if you're so at some point we had like 3 of the big exercise balls that you could sit on. And the same kids get to school early and the same kids get to school late because of their buses. The same kids were sitting on them every day. And so we had a conversation of, if you're the first person in the room, does that mean that you should choose what everybody would regard as like the coolest seat in the room every day just because it's open? And so getting them to realize that they had to make decisions that weren't selfish. And I think that phrase might have been on there, like, don't be selfish, something along those lines. Because, every time that you choose to sit somewhere that you've sat in multiple days in a row, you're choosing to not allow somebody else to sit there. And so getting them to like step outside of their own mindset to realize that, because you have the shyer kids that like aren't willing to ask, things like, like asking someone, can I have that? Like, do you mind if I sit there today? I haven't sat there in a while. And really choosing, how do you want to answer people? Do you want to be nice and say, yeah, sure, go ahead? Or do you want to say no? Well, if you say no, just keep in mind that person's probably going to say no to you next time you ask. So all those pieces about just like creating like a community where you feel respected and you are respectful towards others were the big things that came out of that initial establish the rules. And it really grew and developed and transpired throughout the year with that.
I think it's beautiful. And something that was popping in my head as we kind of conclude this conversation, we can talk other kind of beginning of year items before we wrap up, but the idea of being student-centered sends a message of care and support and maturity. And I think that's a huge thing that when we lecture, and I think that's the hardest part, I feel like we get through a ton of procedures and expectations and materials and all these different things that are often and easily teacher driven because we want to get them done and get to learning, doesn't mean it's internalized. And when you're saying these things, like I said, it's almost like all of those challenges that we see as teachers are minimized, not eliminated, minimized. I think of like, oh, the kid that sat in the same spot over and over again. Well, we talk about tattling versus reporting. Like, what is that's a big conversation at the beginning of the year. Well, that is a functional way to talk about, does Mr. Rogers need to know? Does Mr. Ehrman need to know? Does a school adult need to know? If it's, hey, I want this, but someone else took it first, or they got up, can I move? It almost seems like you don't spend a lot of time on the management of kids, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. It's you'll figure it out, or you need to find a solution, and I'm trusting that you'll come up with something that works for both sides. So
helping them reach that solution. And for some students, it's just saying, figure it out. Others, it's me sitting down and talking to them for 5 minutes, talking about, let's go over what are possible solutions. Really, like you said, feeding into what does that particular child need.
But I think a lot of times, and this is the point that I want to get to, is we as educators talk about being a guide on the side for instruction. I think a lot of times we think about it from the instruction side. They're going to explore their own creativity. They're going to really capitalize and expand beyond the limits that we put on them. But you're also creating that same experience for all aspects, whole child. They are learning how to interact with other classmates in a method that will be a lifelong skill that they acquire at 11 years old. And so I think as we wrap up at least this part of the conversation, I think as you transition from can I make this more student centered is a great question to ask yourself. And if I feel like I'm uncomfortable by that, maybe that's a single activity a day that you set at the first week of school. That is going to be a single activity that they get to explore. And if you want to dive in and get rid of all the furniture in your classroom, be our guests. It will turn challenging and it's exhausting, I'm sure, to just be the puppeteer of everything. But the long outcome, and I'm speaking from my end, I had a more structured version of what Ken did, but the ownership of that classroom is true. The pride of that classroom is true. There is a little thing to I would also say, in addition to administration, let your grade level peers know as well. Because that first lunch period when they share, you won't believe what we did in Mr. Ehrman's class, is a tough thing that we often get sensitive to as educators and humans, what's going on. But a really cool environment that when I did it in, like I said, more structured environment, it set a great standard. I didn't have to go all in like Ken did, but my kids still benefited from it, and it still felt doable on my standard of control and structure and how I wanted to manage things. So
Right.
I appreciate you
would
bringing
just
that
say,
up.
yeah, absolutely. I would just say, regardless, take what I want you to take away from this is not about how to set up your room. It's about how to make that impression on day one. What impression do you want to make on your students, and how are you going to get them excited to come back to your classroom on day two? That is a goal that every teacher can have. Even as secondary teachers, can you set up your room? No, that doesn't make sense when you have 7 classes come in throughout the day. You can't break it down, set it up. Maybe you could find a way to, and I've talked with secondary teachers about this, find a way to kind of like have all the classes kind of mutually decide on some aspects of the room to design it. But even just a simple way, go to breakoutedu.com or breakout.edu, whatever it is, whatever the website is, and just do a breakout with your kids on the first day. A little like breakout room where you're trying to unlock a box. Just have fun. Bring in curricular concepts if you want. If you don't want to, it doesn't matter. It's the first day of school. Do something where you are setting an impression that you want on the first day. I would push you to try to set an impression that matches the culture of the room that you want throughout the year. That was the theme behind mine, but just get them excited to come back on the second day of school. I'll never forget, I had a parent call me and say, I've never seen my son excited after the first day of school. And he could not wait to come back to your room on the second day of school. It's a great feeling. It's a great feeling to know that those kids are excited to be in the room, because that's ultimately what we want. When they're excited to be there, they're going to learn more. That's a simple reality. So I think that's the most important thing to take away from this. When you're approaching this school year and you're approaching that first day, how are you going to set those impressions to get those kids excited to come back to you on the second day? That's something that every teacher can do, kindergarten through 12th grade.
I think it's a great point. And one other thing that you have said multiple times, but we could not end an episode without you bringing it up one more time. One of the most powerful things we can do as teachers is to build a relationship with families even before the school year starts. So right now is a great time to do Ken's favorite teaching trick, which is to reach out to families. It doesn't have to be a crazy long conversation, but I almost think going into before Meet the Teacher night, I would assume, I know people have done postcards before, whatever the case may be. That may be, if you wanted to do something different like Ken did, might be a great thing to prioritize and say, hey, I know Meet the Teachers on Wednesday. I'm going to call every parent by end of the day Tuesday, so that my first interaction with them is professional, as we were kind of talking about before, and my second interaction will be in our environment. getting them in there, and maybe it'll feel a little bit more comfortable as you approach these crazy concepts and experiences that you hope to carry out throughout the rest of the year. And I'll say real quick, setting a standard like this at the beginning of the year of communication but also learning experiences and watching the kids thrive in it is so contagious for the rest of the year. There's never been a time, and even when things blew up in my face, there's never been a time where I said, I don't want to try this or something like it again in the future. It definitely fueled me to continue to pull other experiences into the classroom.
Well, and with what you were saying about that, I would call every family before meet the teacher night, and I think sending postcards are great. Sending a letter is great. Doing anything to reach out to them before the school year is great. Doing something, that's all that matters. But it's one of those things where when you do something a little bit different, which I think calling is a little bit different, not setting up your room is different, and you do something that is a big action, it sets a big impression. I mean, I would always say to my kids, this is our room. But when I literally don't set up the room, I could not make it more obvious to them that I meant that. I truly meant that. And when you call every family, I would get at least half of them as voicemails. I've said before, I don't like making small talk. I'm not comfortable talking to strangers. It was usually a 2-minute phone call. Just, I'm excited to have your child. If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out to me. That's all I wanted them to hear. But, when they get that phone call, every person is having the realization, wow, he's calling 30 people. That's a lot of time. That taking that time is again setting an impression of I'm taking an extra effort versus sending something standardized. And so, like I said, doing anything to reach out before the school year is super important. But anytime you can do something to just set a little bit of an impression just by the action, I think speaks volumes too.
And also following up it when you do have to call parents throughout the year. Obviously, if there's an issue, there's comfort. You're not like, hey, I've been communicating a ton. You haven't been reading my emails. There's an element of making that communication first, but also, like everything else, makes those communications shorter and more direct throughout the year of maintenance. Hey, I'm just calling to share this awesome thing that happened. I have started calling before I have them, and I call within the second day of school. Sometimes first day, sometimes second day, especially if it's a new kid that came in throughout from a different school, or throughout the school year. By the second day that they're there, it could be, I've gotten kids in April, call by the second day that they're in there and check in, and you'll never believe the insight you get in just a 3-minute phone call to a parent of just saying, you know what? Yeah, and many times it's, hey, my kid has loved being with you. Okay, great. We're going to continue to make that a priority and do whatever we can. But it's definitely one of those things that you will not regret unless you don't do it. And then you may regret it, for sure. So that's all I got for you, Ken. Do you have any other insight that you would suggest going into the beginning of the school year, kind of words of wisdom besides what you've already shared to make this year? I know it's still, we're in, as we're recording this, it's one of those, I'm not sure exactly what the regulations are going to be like, what what my classroom can look like. It's going to be flexible until, honestly, the days the kids walk in the morning. That uncertainty is tough, but what would you kind of say to any other follow-ups?
Well, I would just say on that note, I think this year more than ever, depending where you teach, what it looked like last year, you have potentially a lot of kids returning for the first time in a very long time. And so to just repeat what I said before, getting them excited to come back on day 2. You, as teachers, we're supposed to set objectives, measurable outcomes. There's your one measurable outcome for day 1. Are they excited to come back? That's it. That is a goal that I think everybody can strive to accomplish. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't have to be anything about student-centered learning. It doesn't have to be anything about the way you set up your classroom. get them excited to come back to your room on day 2, and then continue that excitement from that point forward as much as you can. And so, no, I just wish everybody best of luck as we start the school year. I'm excited to get back into things and continue our conversations every other week with our guests that we have lined up.
All right. Well, Ken, I think you passed this time. You did a great job sharing. And you may not replicate exactly what he did, but we all wish you to just have an incredible year and make this a memorable and kind of intentional year. I know a lot of that comes with mental flexibility as well. It's going to be as challenging as any other year you've ever had, and we just came off of, many of us, the hardest year we've ever taught. So the kids deserve your very best, and they have much shorter memories than we do. So as always, we hope you are happy, healthy, and well. And as we power down this episode, hopefully we left you feeling powered up. We will talk to you next time.